Okay, this is a review of an article that was written by Megan, Moltein. I believe it's Molten. She writes for Weird, and it was published May 13th, 2021 at 6 a.m. But I'm going to approach this a little bit differently. First, I'm going to give you the players in this death of the 5-micron droplets. First, there's Lindsay Marr. She's an aerosol scientist at Virginia Tech. She also studied infectious diseases. Then there's Linda Morawska, Morawska. She's a revered atmospheric physicist, and she set up a meeting with the WHO to explain how far infectious particles travel. Then there's Hugo Lai. He's an air specialist researcher at the University of Hong Kong. Then there's Jose Luis Jimenez, an atmospheric chemist at the University of Colorado Boulder. Then Tom Irwin, who specializes in the history of tuberculosis and influenza. And then the real wonderful star of this thing is Katie Randall. She's a citation tracker. Then there's William Wells and his wife, Mildred. Then Alexander Langmuir, Languir. He was the chief etymologist at the new CDC July 1st, 1946. Microns, 1 micron is equal to 1 millionth of a meter. That's an important thing that you need to know. So, early one morning, Lindsay Marr tiptoed to her dining room, slipped on her headset, and fired up her Zoom. On her computer screen, a dozen familiar faces began to appear. She also saw a few people she didn't know, and some from the World Health Organization regarding the COVID-19 outbreak. So, it was 1 p.m. Geneva time on April 3rd, 2020. Mars, an aerosol scientist at Virginia Tech, and only a few in the world who also study infectious diseases. To her, the new coronavirus looked like it could be hanging in the air much longer than the CDC or the WHO outlined, infecting anyone who breathed in the air. For people indoors, that posed a considerable risk, but the WHO didn't seem to have caught on. Just days before, the organization had tweeted fact that COVID-19 is not airborne. That's why Marr was skipping the usual morning workout at her morning workout, and the 35 other aerosol scientists were on the Zoom meeting, trying to warn the WHO that it was making a big mistake. Over Zoom, they laid out their cases, trickled through a growth of things that were going on, looking at the different events, the super spreading events that took place in restaurants, call centers, cruise ships, and even choir rehearsals. More people were getting sick from across the room from a contagious person. The incident contradicted what WHO's main safety guideline is to keep from 3 to 6 feet distancing, the social distancing guideline, and frequent hand washing. The SARS-2 COVID vaccine travels only in large droplets that immediately fell to the ground, as the WHO was saying. That wouldn't be a distance that would really hurt anybody. So, hand washing helps to prevent such outbreaks also. Infectious air was more likely the culprit, but the WHO apparently was unmoved. If they were going to call COVID-19 airborne, they wanted to have more direct evidence and proof, which could take months to gather, and the virus was abundant in the air. Meanwhile, thousands of people were falling ill every single day. Morowitz had spent more than 2 decades advising different branches of the WHO on the impact of air pollution. When it came to the flecks of soot and ashes belched out by smokestacks and tailpipes, the organization readily accepted the physics that she was describing, that the particles of many sizes can hang aloft, travel far, and be inhaled. But though the WHO advisors seems to be saying that those same laws didn't apply to a virus-laced respiratory particles. To them, the word airborne only applies to particles smaller than 5 microns. Trapped in the group's specific jargon, the two camps on the Zoom literally could not understand each other. According to the medical canon, nearly all respiratory infectious transmissions through coughing and sneezing. Whether a sick person hacks bacteria and viruses spread out like a bullet from a gun, which quickly fall and stick to surfaces within a blast radius of 3 to 6 feet. If the droplets align with your nose and mouth or hand as you touch something and touch your face, then it can cause an infection. Only a few diseases were thought to break the droplet rules. Measles and tuberculosis were the 2 exceptions, transmitted a different way. They're described as airborne. Those pathogens travel inside aerosols, microscopic particles that can stay suspended for hours and travel longer distances. They can spread when contagious people simply just breathe in the air. The distinction between droplet and airborne transmission has an enormous consequences. To combat droplets, the leading precautions is to wash hands frequently with soap and water. To fight infectious aerosol, the air itself is the enemy. In hospitals, it means an expensive and HVAC systems and isolation wards and N95 masks for all medical staff. This is the heart of the error. The error meant the medical community had distorted picture of how people might get sick. Marr described the collection. Marr decided to collect some data of her own, installing air samplers in places such as daycares and airplanes. She frequently found the flu virus where textbooks said it shouldn't be, hiding in the air, most often in particles small enough to stay aloft for hours. And there was enough of it to make people sick. Thinking it might help her to overcome the resistance, she tried a few times to figure out where the flawed 5-micron figure came from. But she got stuck. The medical textbook simply stated it was fact, without any citations, as it were pulled from the air itself. Finally, she got tired of trying to research, and life moved on, and the 5-micron mystery faded into the background until December 2019, when a paper crossed her desk from the lab of Hugo Lai. Lai made his name for himself in the first SARS outbreak in 2003, but during the intervening decade, he struggled to convince the public health community that the risk calculus was off. Not by much, but by a lot. His team findings, they argued, exposed the fallacy of the 5-micron boundary. And they'd gone a step farther, tracing the number back to decades-old documents that the CDC had published for hospitals. A few days later, the April Zoom meeting, with who, Marr got an email from another aerosol scientist who had been on the call. an atmospheric chemist at the University of Colorado Boulder named Jose Luis Jimenez. He became fixated on the WHO's recommendation that people stay 3 to 6 feet apart from one another. As far as he could tell, the social distancing guidelines seemed to be based on a few studies from the 1930s and 40s. But the authors of those experiments actually argued the possibility of airborne transmission, which by definition would involve a distance of over 6 feet, and none of it seemed to add up. Marr told him about her concerns of the 5 micron boundary and suggested that the two issues might be linked. If the 6-foot guideline was built off of an incorrect definition of droplets, the 5 micron error wasn't just a small detail. It seemed to sit at the heart of the WHO and the CDC flawed guidance. Finding its original suddenly became a priority. But hunting it down, Mars and Jimenez had a problem. They needed somebody that could research history. Luckily, Marr knew someone at Virginia Tech, a scholar named Tom Irwin, who specialized in the history of tuberculosis and influenza. They talked. He suggested that they bring on board a graduate student he happened to know who was good at this particular type of historic forensics. The graduate student in question was named Katie Randall. Randall has studied citation tracking, a type of scholastic detective work where the clues aren't blood spatters or stray fibers, but buried references to long ago studies, reports, and other records. She started digging where Lai and the others had left off. With various WHO and CDC papers, she didn't find any more clues than they did. It was kind of a dead end. A Harvard engineer named William Wells did publish a book in 1955 that was called Airborne Contagion and Air Hygiene. In 1934, Wells and his wife Mildred, a physician, analyzed air samples and plotted the curves showing how the opposing forces of gravity and evaporation acted on the respiratory particles. A couple calculations made it possible to predict the time it would take for a particle of a given size to travel from someone's mouth to the ground. According to them, particulates bigger than 100 microns sank within seconds. Smaller particles stayed in the air. Randall paused at the curve that she was looking at in the drawing from the book. To her, it seemed like foreshadowing of the idea of the droplet aerosol dichotomy, but one that should have been pivoted around the 100 microns, not the 5 microns. One night, Randall was reading about the experiments Wells did in the 1940s, in which he installed air disinfectant ultraviolet lights inside of schools and classrooms. With the UV lamps installed, fewer kids came down with the measles. He concluded that the measles virus must have been in the air. Randall was struck by this. She knew that the measles didn't get recognized as airborne disease until decades later. What had happened? Now we have evidence also that a UV ray can kill germs. That's the second part of this study. Part of the medical rhetoric is understanding why certain ideas take hold and others don't. Then she looked at how others perceived weeks. That led her to Alexander Langmuir, Langmuir, an influential chief etymologist at the newly established CDC. Like his peers, Langmuir had been brought up in the gospel of personal cleanliness and observations that made hand washing the bedrock of the U.S. public health policy. He seemed to view Wells' ideas about airborne transmission as retrograde, seeing in them a slide back towards the ancient irrational terror of bad air. He didn't want to go back that way because the public really had a bad taste in it. This was 100 years before. It was called the MIASMA theory. It had prevailed for centuries, so Longmire dismissed them as little more than interesting theoretical points. Then when Randall returned to Wells' book a few days later, she noticed that he had written about those industrial hygiene studies that Longmire had mentioned. They had inspired Wells to investigate the role of particle sizes in the likes of natural respiratory infections. He designed a study using tuberculosis causing bacteria. The bug was handy and could be aerosoled. And if it landed in the lungs, it grew into small lesions. He exposed rabbits to similar doses of bacteria, pumped into their chambers from the tuberculosis affected ward. All of them smaller than 5 microns, or of course they're bigger than 5 microns in a miss. The animals got the fine treatment and fell ill. Upon autopsy, it was clear that their lungs had been bludgeoned with all these lesions. The bunnies that received the coarse blast appeared to be no worse for wear. As she got into Longmire's later writing, she observed a shift in his tone. In an article in 1980, he leaned towards, as Longmire later writings, she observed a shift in his tone. In articles he wrote up into the 1980s, towards the end of his career, he admitted that he'd been wrong about the airborne infection. It was possible. A big part of what changed Longmire's mind was one of Wells' final studies. Working at the VA hospital in Baltimore, Wells and his collaborators had pumped exhaust air from the tuberculosis ward into the cages of 150 guinea pigs in the building's top floor. Month after month, a few guinea pigs came down with tuberculosis. Still, public health authorities were skeptical. They complained that the experiment lacked controls. So, Wells teamed up again and put in another 150 animals. This time they included a UV light germ killing light fixture to kill the germs in the air. Those guinea pigs stayed healthy. And it was the first uncontrovertible evidence that human disease, tuberculosis, could be airborne. Not even the public bigwigs could avoid that one. Longmire mentioned later in a speech that he gave to public health workers that it was Wells that said that he had to thank for illuminating him in the inadequate responses of the growing epidemic of tuberculosis. He emphasized that the problematic was particles, and that the ones they had to worry about were smaller than 5 microns. So you can see the idea of what was respirable, what stays airborne, and what infectious are being flattened into the 5 micron phenomenon. Randall says, over time, and through blind repetition, the error sank deeper into the medical canon. The CDC did not respond to multiple requests for comments about this. Marr said, oh my gosh, this is where the 5 micron came from. After all these years, she finally had her answer. But getting to the bottom of the 5 micron myth was only the first step. Dislodging it from decades of public health doctrine would mean convincing 2 of the world's most powerful health authorities not only that they were wrong, but that the error was incredibly and urgently consequential, and to add a layman's comment, very deadly. In July, Marr and Jimenez went public, signing their names to an open letter addressed to the public health authorities, including WHO, along with 237 other scientists and physicians. They warned that without stronger recommendations for masking and ventilation, airborne spread of SARS-CoV-2 would undermine the efforts and whatever they were doing. Even the vigorous testing and tracing and social distancing wouldn't help. The news made headlines. Days later, the WHO released an updated scientific brief acknowledging that aerosol couldn't be ruled out, especially in poorly ventilated places. In July, the two women, Mars and Parther, sent slides to Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease. One of them showed the trajectory of the 5-micron particles released from the height of an average person's mouth. It went farther than 6 feet, hundreds of feet farther. A few weeks later, speaking at an audience at Harvard Medical School, Fauci admitted that the 5-micron distinction was wrong. It had been for years. Bottom line is, there is much more aerosol than we thought, he said. Still, the droplet dogma reigned. In early October, Marr and a group of scientists and doctors published a letter in Science, urging everyone to get on the same page about how infectious particles move, starting by ditching the 5-micron threshold. Only then could they provide clear and effective advice to the public. The same day, the CDC updated its guidelines to acknowledge that the SARS-CoV-2 can spread through long lingering aerosols, but it didn't emphasize it. In December 1st, the organization finally recommended that everyone wear masks indoors where COVID-19 is spreading. In an interview with the WHO, it was said that it reflects the organization's commitment to make an evolving the guidelines with the scientific evidence as it compels the change. One of the spokesperson mentioned that first in hospital and places such as bars and restaurants. The reason we're promoting ventilation is that virus can be airborne. But because the term has specific meanings and the medical community, he admitted that they avoided it. The emphasis instead is on the type of things that were posing the biggest risks. She didn't think that the decision was harming the public's health response. No lives were cost. No, she says, people know what they need to do to protect themselves. That really wasn't true. For Mr. Lai, whose work had so inspired Marr, these moves had given him a sliver of hope. Tragedy always teaches us something, he said. The lessons he thinks people are finally starting to learn is airborne transmission is both more complex and less scary than it once believed in SARS-2, like many respiratory diseases, it's airborne, but it's not wildly so. It's not like measles, which is so contagious that it affects 90% of the susceptible people exposed at some time at any given time in the virus. And the evidence hasn't shown that coronavirus often affects people over really long distances or in well-ventilated spaces. Mostly outside air is the important key here. The various spreads mostly affect the immediate vicinity of the contagious person, which is to say most of the time it looks an awful lot like a textbook droplet-based pathogen. For most respiratory diseases, not knowing which route causes the infection can be catastrophic, but the cost has not been zero. Influenza infections, millions each year, killing 300 to 650,000 globally. Epidemiologists are predicting the next few years will be particularly more deadly in flu season. Lai hopes that acknowledging this history and how it hindered the effective global response of COVID-19 will allow good ventilation to emerge as a central pillar of public health. A development that would not hasten the end of the pandemic, but it would help beat back the future ones. To get a glimpse into the future, we need to only peek into the classroom where Lai teaches and the CrossFit gym where Mar jumps boxes and slams medicine balls. In the early days of the pandemic, Lai convinced the administrations at the University of Hong Kong to spend most of its COVID-19 budget on upgrading the ventilation in the buildings and buses rather than things such as mass COVID testing for the students. Mar reviewed the blueprints and the HVAC schematics with the owner of her gym, calculating that the ventilation rate and consulting on her experts, they redesigned and moved the workstations outside and near doors where they kept them primarily opened at all times. To date, no one has caught COVID in the gym. Lai's university has 60,000 to 30,000 students, and they've only recorded 23 COVID-19 cases. Of course, Mar's gym is small, and the university benefited from the fact that Asian countries were scared by the SARS 2003 epidemic, were quickly to recognize aerosol transmission. But Mar and Lai's swift action will help to improve their odds. Ultimately, that's what the public health guidelines do. They tilt people and places closer to safety. She, Lai, and two other aerosol scientists had just published an editorial in the BMJ, a top medical journal, entitled COVID-19 has redefined airborne transmission. For once, she hadn't had to beg for a journal to publish their work. The journal came to her and her team and finally posted her paper on the origins of the 5-micron error in the public preprint server. Early in May, the CD made a similar changes in its COVID-19 guidance, now placing the inhalation of aerosols at the top of its list of the disease spread. Again, though, no news, no conference, no press release. Even so, with all the errors that were made, we are a resilient group of survivors. We made it through and beat COVID-19 scourge, and we will do so in the future. Thank you for listening to this.